There was once a time in the not so distant past when buying an SUV that was capable of fitting the whole family in meant that you had to shell out a fair chunk of your paycheck at the petrol pump. Thankfully, those days are over for the most part, with most mid-size SUVs being pretty reasonable drinkers at the petrol pump. For today's comparison, I've got two examples of those reasonable drinkers at the petrol pump. In one corner, there's the $61,000 Nissan X-Trail E-Power in its beautiful champagne gold shade, and in the other corner, we've got the Haval H6 Ultra Hybrid, which starts around $46,000 drive away. Now, it shouldn't take a mathematician to work out that there's actually a $15,000 difference between these two hybrid-powered SUVs on the road. So for today's comparison, we're basically going to work out if it's worth shelling out the extra dosh on the Nissan. So without further ado, let's get into it. Chasing cars. Honest reviews of your next car.
Brought to you by
Budget Direct.
First up on the looks front, this Haval H6 here, it's not exactly anything special. Obviously it's got that large chrome grille at the front, which we see a lot on these Chinese built vehicles, but other than that, especially in this white shade, it won't be turning heads. This isn't helped by the fact that it rides on rather pedestrian looking silver 19-inch alloy wheels. And at the other end of the extroverted car spectrum, we've got this X-Trail E-Power, and I mean, it's not exactly reserved. From the bold headlight design, the big V-shaped grille at the front here, and to that black roof, which contrasts nicely with that champagne colour. I mean, it is really in your face. This is also backed up by those large 20-inch alloy wheels that it rides on, which are actually the biggest you can get in the range. When you first get into the cabin of this Haval H6 Ultra, it feels premium, and for the most part it is. I mean, when you start digging into it a little bit more, you kind of see where Haval has somewhat cheaped out on things. For instance, you've got a massive piano black assembly here, which this car has a few thousand Ks on it, I'll give it that, but already there's a lot of fingerprints and scratches, so it just feels kind of cheap. And the same goes for the sound system, because while it's got these fancy aluminium speaker covers up here, the ones down here are cheap kind of scratchy plastic, and if I'm honest, it doesn't sound all that good either. In saying that, I actually really like the steering wheel. I mean, again, it feels kind of cheap with the vinyl-y feeling leather and the plastic silver inserts here, but it's really thin, and I feel like that's a thing that's overlooked in today's car industry because, I mean, especially BMW, the steering wheels, you kind of hold them like that, whereas the days are gone of just a nice ergonomic thin steering wheel. As for the screens, they feel premium because you get a 12.3-inch infotainment display here and a 10.25-inch digital cluster behind the steering wheel. This system includes wired Apple CarPlay and wired Android Auto, but it's worth noting that satellite navigation isn't included. There's a wireless phone charger down here underneath the HVAC controls, which I'll add are quite nice because you do get manual buttons down here. But when you want to dive into it and actually adjust all the individual settings, you're going to have to do it up on the screen here, which, I mean, is a bit fidgety, especially when you're trying to focus on the road. There is a heads-up display up here, and surprisingly, despite the relatively cheap price point of this H6, it's not one of those ones that has a little fold-out screen. This one projects straight onto the windscreen, and it looks great. Like most Havals, my pet peeve is back in this H6, which is this rotary gear selector. There's a big P button in the middle, which obviously puts it in park, but the problem arises when you want to select any other gear because there isn't actually a stopper on when the rotary dial will spin. So when you're trying to do a 3-point turn in a hurry, you can be confused as to what gear you're in and what gear you're selecting, and more times than not, I've ended up in neutral, which, I mean, is quite frustrating. And lastly, the seats, they're faux leather covered. They don't provide much in the way of support at all, so I can imagine they'll get quite uncomfortable on long journeys. One saving grace is both seats here in the front row do have power adjustment. They are heated, and there's also a steering wheel heater, so at least in winter you'll be comfortable. Back here in the second row, the same sort of facade of a premium interior continues because you get paneling that looks like the soft touch up front, but you'll notice the door cards back here, hard scratchy plastic. There's also quite a bit of piano black used across the door cards, but one big benefit of this H6 is the sheer amount of room that's provided in the second row because I've got an abundance of headroom and plenty of leg room, so even on a long trip, and probably with 3 people across the middle here, you still wouldn't get too uncomfortable. And lastly, on the amenities front, because this H6 Ultra only comes with dual zone climate control, there are just air vents back here, so there's no temperature or fan speed control. You do get a couple of USB-A charging ports, which is a nice bonus. And lastly, a panoramic sunroof comes standard, and it is massive. Moving into the X-Trail TIL now, and there's no question as to whether or not Nissan has hit the nail on the head when it comes to how luxurious this cabin is. There's a plethora of soft touch materials around this cabin. There's soft touches on top of the door cards and the armrest. There's soft leather here. In the middle, a little interesting, there's this plasticky kind of wood grain material that, I mean, let's be real, it's better than piano black, but I don't know, I feel like in a few years the wood grain that's also up here might feel a little dated, like what we've seen in the early 2000s cars. More luxury comes into the picture from the quilted leather seats that come on this TIL. They are heated, but unfortunately there is no ventilation, which will be a shame as the Australian summer heats up. As for the displays, you get a large 12.3-inch digital cluster behind the steering wheel and also a big heads-up display, and again, like that Haval, it projects straight onto the windscreen so it's easy to see. In the middle here, there's a 12.3-inch infotainment display that gets wireless Apple CarPlay. It also gets satellite navigation to round out those creature comforts. As for the amenities, Nissan has seemingly crammed everything possible into this interior. There's a 12-volt socket, USB-C, USB-A, a wireless phone charger, and the climate controls are all housed down here with old-fashioned knobs and buttons, so they're quite easy to use when on the move. A Bose sound system is also thrown in to round out this package. As a whole, there's no question that Nissan has made the interior of this X-Trail TIL a lot more comfortable than what is offered in that Haval H6 Ultra. Back here, the quilted leather seats continue, as does that overall premium feeling, only slightly let down by the fact that this panel, which looks leather, is actually hard touch, but hey, it's the same in that H6, so it's no big loss for the X-Trail. One area where the X-Trail loses points is in the overall practicality of this back seat, because this bench right here sits actually quite high, meaning that headroom is quite limited, and I'd say I'm probably like 4 or 5 centimeters off the roof here, meaning if you're much taller than 6 foot, you might actually struggle to sit back here. Even so, legroom follows a similar theme, and so does footroom, so I have to say, a little underwhelmed by the practicality offered back here. As for amenities, this X-Trail TIL actually comes with tri-zone climate control as standard, meaning you get fan speed and temperature control from these air vents when you sit back here. There are also heated seats, as well as a USB-C and a USB-A charge port. And just like that H6, there's a massive panoramic sunroof that comes as standard in this TIL grade. So at the back of this H6 Ultra Hybrid, you get a power tailgate, which is a nice inclusion. And when that opens, you get access to 600 litres of space. And it's worth noting that that isn't down on the regular H6, meaning that the hybrid battery that sits underneath here doesn't impede on your luggage space. What you do miss out on though with this hybrid is a spare wheel of any sort. Instead, you're gonna have to make do with a goo kit that sits here in this polystyrene holder thing. As for amenities, it's pretty bare back here. You do get a luggage cover and a pair of 12-volt sockets that sit on either side of the boot. Like the Haval, this X-Trail TIL comes standard with a power tailgate, and as for luggage space, you get access to 575 litres in here. It is worth noting that this is 10 litres down on the non-hybrid variant, meaning that all the electrical componentry and the batteries down here does impede on the space. But what you do get is Nissan's fancy storage solution, which consists of a pair of dividers that sit here that can break up the boot so you can fit your groceries, your soccer ball, or whatever else you carry around in the back of your car. And lastly, it's also worth noting that this Nissan right here has a braked towing capacity of up to 1.6 tonnes, whilst that H6 Ultra Hybrid over there is only 1.5 tonnes. So Nissan claims a combined fuel economy figure of 6.1 litres per 100 kilometres for this X-Trail E-Power right here. During testing, we actually managed to better that figure and ended up with 5.6 litres per 100 kilometres, which is a nice figure to land on. And Nissan actually recommends 95 octane for this car, but they also say that it can run on 95, which will kind of put owners in an awkward position, so I guess you guys can decide what you put in this. In terms of servicing, X-Trail owners will shell out $2,113 over a 5-year period to service their vehicle. This is with service intervals occurring every 12 months or 10,000 kilometres. It's also worth noting that this car right here is covered under Nissan Australia's 5-year or unlimited kilometre warranty. Over the last 12 months, the median budget direct customer paid $958 to comprehensively insure their new Nissan X-Trail. Your premium may vary based on things that insurers take into account, such as your age, driving history, where you live, and whether or not you garage the car. Now in this running cost segment, it's easy to see that this Haval H6 has taken the win by a long shot. Haval claims a combined fuel economy figure of 5.2 litres per 100 kilometres for this H6 hybrid. During testing, we managed 5.5, which is a little off that claim, but still, it's better than the Nissan. Also, this H6 Ultra Hybrid only needs 91 to run, and there's no strange recommendations, so it'll be cheaper in the long run. As for servicing the Haval, H6 Hybrid owners will shell out $1,650 over a 5-year period to service their SUV. This is again with service intervals occurring every 12 months or 10,000 kilometres. And then for the warranty, again, Haval's got an easy win considering that the brand in Australia offers a 7-year unlimited kilometre plan. Over the last 12 months, the median budget direct customer paid $995 to comprehensively insure their new Haval H6. Your premium may vary based on things that insurers take into account, such as your age, driving history, where you live, and whether or not you garage the car. So under the bonnet of this X-Trail E-Power sits a 1.5 litre turbocharged petrol engine that makes 106 kilowatts and 215 Nm of torque. But you've got to remember, with this E-Power system, this engine is purely just a generator that's there to feed the batteries for the electric all-wheel drive system. And speaking of that system, it has a peak power output of 157 kilowatts. That's broken down to 330 Nm in the front and 195 on that rear axle. In the real world, this E-Power system translates to a remarkably refined drive. I mean, you get the noise of the petrol engine up front, but in terms of the power and torque delivery, you'd assume this is just an EV because it's so strong and doesn't have as much of a power band. Now, I say as much of a power band because it's an interesting thing with this car, and the fact that you'd kind of assume for all the torque to be there at once, like all electric vehicles, but as you rev up the engine, you do notice in the mid-range sort of a power bump or a torque bump. I think that might just purely be built in to try and familiarise drivers with this E-Power system and make it feel like it's more of a traditional ICE-powered car. But with an electric all-wheel drive system beneath you, this X-Trail, it provides a confidence in the drive because it's so sure-footed in what it does. Dry, wet, it really doesn't matter the condition because it will always equally distribute torque, and wheel spin is almost non-existent. I mean, I haven't experienced it at all, but I assume if you really start pushing on in wet conditions through the corners, you will find a bit of slip. One negative that I've found from the driving dynamics of this car is the ride. And that could be because this sits on those 20-inch alloy wheels, which are the largest you can get in the range, and it just gives it sort of a sharp feeling compared to that rather soft and boat-like Haval H6. But on the flip side of that, the suspension being slightly stiffer and the tyres having less sidewall translates to a much more direct drive, meaning you can push it through the corners and have faith in that electric all-wheel drive system gripping up and getting you through to the other side. As far as safety systems go, Nissan's full ProPilot suite is standard in this X-Trail TIL, meaning you get all those advanced systems that you'd hope for in a modern car. And in my experience, the Nissan systems are tuned really well for Australian roads. The adaptive cruise control is nice to use, the lane keep assist isn't too intrusive, and also you get a reassuring little sound when the lane keep assist locks into place, and it kind of gives you confidence in the system because you can see it's active and you can feel it slightly holding you in place, but again, not trying to rip the steering wheel out of your hands. Beneath the bonnet of the H6 Ultra Hybrid sits a 1.5 litre turbocharged 4-cylinder petrol engine that pumps out 110 kilowatts and 230 Nm of torque. Now, unlike that X-Trail, which runs sort of like a range extender petrol generator sort of situation, this Haval uses far more of a traditional series parallel hybrid system where the electric motor works in conjunction with that petrol engine. So right off the bat, you can tell that this H6 isn't as refined as what that X-Trail E-Power is. And the first thing that tells you that is just the transition between electric and petrol is far more noticeable, with that petrol engine kind of breaking the ambience and the refinement of the cabin. With the Nissan being all-wheel drive and this Haval being exclusively front-wheel drive, you'd kind of expect a bit of a change in power delivery, but as a whole you'd hope for not much different, with both being modern hybrid vehicles. But unfortunately, this Haval here is just a little unruly on throttle. Off the line, the abundance of electric torque is really clear, and it overpowers those front wheels to the point that you're left wondering how well the traction control system in this car is actually tuned. And unfortunately, this only gets worse at speed, because we actually tested these cars in the rain And what I found is around 50-60 k's an hour, if you put the boot in and give it a bit of gas, it will actually spin the front wheels, which is a concerning thing that no family-friendly SUV should really have to worry about. This isn't helped by the vagueness of the steering system that translates very little back through the steering wheel. But one area where this Haval wins, and I mentioned it before, it's the ride. Because this H6 sits on 19-inch wheels, which are smaller than an X-Trail, it allows for more sidewall. That, compared with a softer suspension tune, means that this Haval is actually more pleasant to ride around the city in and on the open road. Now, with any sort of soft suspension system, you do lose a bit of the directness and the performance dynamic suffers, but if I'm honest, no one that's buying a hybrid powered mid-size SUV that is probably intended to fit their whole family in should really be driving with much spirit on the road. Haval's full suite of safety systems also comes standard in this H6 Ultra, and the inclusions are basically exactly the same as that X-Trail. There's adaptive cruise control, blind spot monitoring, lane keep assist, but I mean, like the rest of the car, it just doesn't feel as refined in these systems. The main example of this was in the lane keep assist system that seems to hold the wheel very tight and kind of railroads you where to go. You obviously can overpower it with a bit of steering force, but if anything, I find that kind of upsets the balance of the car and you're kind of left battling the system half the time, which is never fun. And also to this point, this car's camera and sensor system can be somewhat unsure of different road markings, so it might actually lead you astray through different lanes, which again, probably isn't the safest thing for the system to do. So although we might have been comparing apples to oranges on both price and technical fronts, the bottom line here is both these hybrid-powered mid-size SUVs will be popular choices with families across the country, both of which are the most expensive of their types, and this is reflected in the build quality, driving dynamics, and the extensive feature lists inside. But unfortunately for that Haval H6 Ultra Hybrid, the Nissan is just too much of a cohesive package, even with that $15,000 premium thrown on top. The interior feels more complete, and it's much more sure-footed on the road with that fantastic electric all-wheel drive system.
Nissan Australia recently introduced an X-Trail STL E-Power that is over $8,000 cheaper on the road than this TIL variant. Honestly, I'd say that this is the pick of the bunch because it still gets that fantastic electric all-wheel drive system, but it sits at a much more competitive price point.
But those are just my thoughts on these two mid-sized SUVs. Let me know what you think, if I got it right, if I got it wrong, in the comments down below, and while you're down there, be sure to subscribe. And as always, thanks for watching Chasing Cars.